I'm John Olsen, I'm the moderator, and we are here to talk about developing for consoles versus PC. My background is that I have spent 7 years in console game development at a couple different studios here in the Salt Lake area. Aside from that, I probably have a total of maybe 30 mumble years of software development, generally concentrating on things tied to graphics. So that's a little bit different than the spiel I usually use where I talk about all the different short stories and novels. So we'll just move on down with that.
All right. I'm Jay Barnson. I have also worked in the video game industry for several years, tried to escape, but like the mafia, they pulled me back in for several years. I think I made an escape this time. And like apparently everyone on this panel right here, I work in the simulation industry now, work with VR and stuff. But
that's only sort of an escape.
Yeah, it's sort of an escape. It's halfway. But anyway, yes, I started out at a game company. Actually, John and I worked together at Single Track back in the PlayStation 1 days. I worked on games Twisted Metal, Warhawk, Jet Moto, a few games that kind of tanked, but you might have heard of. You know, there was, I guess you worked on Streak and Critical Depth, and I worked on Outwars, which is for Microsoft. I worked on the Animorphs game. For those of you who remember the Animorphs books, they were really popular once upon a time. I worked on the game for what was supposed to be a hit movie. It also kind of tanked, The Tale of Despero, which was a really, really good children's book, and the movie didn't work great. So the video game based on the movie was based on the book didn't do so great either. Anyway, I also worked on indie games, Void War, and a role-playing game known as Frayed Knights, The Skull of Smackdown, which is kind of a tongue-in-cheek, but still very in-depth and, according to some people, a little bit hard role-playing game. Anyway, and then I'm also an author, which has distracted me somewhat from my game development. There's only so many hours in a day, and I really try to do everything, but you need to get your minimum of 3 hours of sleep a night, or it just does not work.
My name is Brennan Smith. I worked in the BYU Games program. My thesis advisor and we sort of put it together. I was in some of the 3 first BYU games. I graduated with a master's degree in computer science with an emphasis in game design, the first person to have that emphasis at BYU. I put myself through graduate school making Minecraft mod packs. My most popular pack, Blightfall, had a little over 2 million downloads. And then from there, I went into making virtual reality training simulations for like solar panel installation and HVAC troubleshooting and other boring stuff. And I'm making games on the side right now, trying to get an indie game published.
Because playing with virtual reality just isn't cool enough.
No, playing with virtual reality is cool. Installing heating and air conditioning, that's not as cool. But, I mean, when you've got boring stuff that you do in VR, it sort of averages out to being a pretty cool job.
VR makes everything a little bit cooler.
Yeah.
Okay, so what about the difference between the whole console versus PC thing? What are the advantages of working with PC?
I don't know if you want to jump in first, or you haven't done much console stuff.
I was thinking the advantages of console stuff.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll start with the PC.
Go for it.
And I've got the historical perspective because I'm old. Anyway, the PC traditionally has been a lot more of an open platform, and so anybody can jump back in the day when we were doing PlayStation 1 stuff. You know, to get a dev kit for a place, you had to get licensed by Sony, and the dev kits cost like $24,000. You know, it's like if you were not a serious studio who could prove yourself to Sony and bow down before them, they were not going to grant you a license to work on their games. No way. And there was a whole bunch of stuff back in the old Atari days that was part of the reason why they did that. I'll be getting too much into the console. I can talk about the console business a bit. It was quite a racket. It was, yeah. They lose money on every console they give. They sell to people the first year, but they make it up by taking out developer blood. Anyway, so the PC, you didn't have to worry about that. It was anybody could get on the PC and you get a compiler and boom, you're off to the races. The problems with the PC, if we're talking advantages versus disadvantages, but anyway, so the PC was very open. You could sell your games anywhere. You could sell it from your own little website. Back in the day, they had shareware stuff when they didn't have the web. It was, here, copy my game, please, because there was lots of rampant piracy, and that was the thing. It's like, we're going to take advantage of this. Copy my game, and then people would copy like the full version of the game and pirate it anyway. But that's besides the point. You still had guys like who made Doom, who made a lot of money doing the shareware thing.
To put it mildly.
Yeah. Not nearly as much as Minecraft. They wish they had the Minecraft success. But anyway...
Minecraft had the free version too at the beginning.
That's true.
The first,
early alphas and stuff. But anyway, they had the whole thing where it's like, here, copy this and play the game. Well, it's a drug dealer, thing. Play the first third of it. It's free. And then when you want some more, come to talk to us and pay us some money, and we'll, get. So the distribution model, you could, do it in the stores. You could do it from your own website. You could go through a lot of these online distributors. There's just a lot of freedom there, and so it was really, really easy for an indie developer to make a game and distribute it. For the bigger studios, downside was usually the consoles usually had a bigger install base of gamers, and so you could usually sell more games on the console. But the problem is, like I mentioned, how the consoles will, bleed the crap out of the developers. That was very much the case, and so for a, $50 game that was sold for the Nintendo, the developer was likely to see, once the accounting was taken care of and they paid back their advances and they had that margin that they kept in reserve and all this other stuff, they might get $12 to $15 out of it. Whereas for the PC, you sold a game for $50, you got the $50. And so even though you might not sell, as many titles on the PC, you got to capture a lot more of that market. And so it was, you could make a lot of money per game. The downsides of it is still the case, but less so. The PC is not a specific target, and maybe we'll talk about that with consoles. But when you're talking the PC, it's like, what PC are you talking about? We're not just talking about Mac versus Windows. We're talking about, what kind of hardware do you have? What kind of video card do you have? How big is your monitor? What input devices are you using? A game controller? If so, what kind? This weird kind from China that no one else has ever supported, and
Intel versus AMD.
Yeah, Intel versus AMD. It's a moving target, and it was even a bigger challenge back in, historically, because hardware was progressing so quickly that you create what you think is going to be just the mind-blowing game of the century, when it's released. If you overestimated how the technology is going, your game's going to run like crap. The very first, I remember Unreal. The first Unreal came out, and people were like, "Man, that's the most beautiful slideshow ever for the PC," because they'd overestimated how much PC performance would improve and how much the install base of the new 3D cards would be, and so for most gamers' PC, the game was running like a slideshow. It was very slow and and bad. Yeah.
Turn-based first-person shooter.
Yeah, turn-based first-person shooter. I remember that. Anyway, and if you overestimated or underestimated how much the hardware would go, by the time your game comes out and you've just spent 2 years and 8 people or to 15 people or a bigger ton of money developing this game, and it comes out and everyone's like, oh, that looks like an old Super Nintendo game or something. It was it comes out, and someone else who is more aggressive than you comes, because it's the graphics there was a graphics war back then, and he with the mostest won because that was the one that had the best screenshots and got the best reviews because it was pretty. And yours, but mine runs really good on the target hardware. Okay, that's worth something, but it's not worth money. So those are some of the downsides and frustrations that we're kind of on the PC.
From what I understand, in the intervening time and now modern, the same things sort of apply, that the consoles have a higher barrier to entry and the PCs are more accessible, but those, whether or not that's a strength or a weakness, has sort of almost turned on its head. Because of the rise of engines like the Unreal Engine and the Unity Engine, now it has become so easy to make computer games that there's sort of like a supersaturation and abundance of really, really bad computer games. And you're starting to see in Steam Greenlight, and more recently, even worse, Steam Direct, that now a lot of online marketplaces are getting flooded with like asset flips, things that are basically just take a whole bunch of stuff from like the Unity asset store, plug it into a game. The game is horrible, but that doesn't matter because the developers are in Nicaragua. And if you manage to get like, several $100 from an asset flip, that's big money in some countries, you know what I mean? So, and because of that, people are incentivized to keep doing it, and then the quality of games just keeps going down. Now, the additional barriers to entry can, in some ways, make consoles better. If you're able to get something onto the Nintendo store by going through their, like, really draconian, it's hard to get something on there because you've got to meet so many specifications. But then if you can, and suddenly you're on a store on the Nintendo Switch as an indie developer, people they browse the Nintendo store for good-looking games, and so it's almost like getting into a brick and mortar store in the old days it would have been, is that now you've got a spot on the shelf where people who are looking for games can say, oh, this is something that looks interesting to me. In some ways, if you can make a game that passes the barriers to entry, then it's a lot easier to get exposure on consoles than it is to get exposure on computer games. Also, as he said, a lot of times it's a moving target because you have on PCs, you've got all sorts of different system specs. You don't know what exactly the player's hardware is going to end up being, and a lot of the Unreal and Unity, they make it easier to develop games, but they don't necessarily make it tight to develop games, or you have a tight core gameplay loop that runs really smoothly. There's a lot of cruft on the outside of these engines that might provide functionality that you don't use in your games, and so it ends up being more than you need, and because of that it slows down performance. Trying to make a game that is performant on toasters can be more difficult than it was in the C++ era, where you had control over every frame and every gameplay loop. You can make something that is a lot more performant because you know that the player has at least a minimum spec of hardware on the PS4 or on the Switch or something like that, and you can target that platform a lot more consistently than trying to target a broad range of where PCs can be.
But on the flip side, if you do something that's very targeted, you really want to make sure that you already have buy-in from Nintendo before you spend much money on it, because if you're doing it and they're like, oh no, we've already got another game with a similar genre that is coming out about the same time, and your entire marketing plan is build this game for the Nintendo and then release it, and and let the money roll in. Is it the underpants gnomes, their business plan, steal underpants, something, profit. And your whole plan is, I'm releasing on the Nintendo and I'm going to make, millions, and suddenly Nintendo says, no, sorry, we're not going to do this for whatever reason. You're host.
And I guess it's worse on the Nintendo than on some other platforms because the Nintendo tends to have some really unique hardware gimmicks. And if you build your game around those hardware gimmicks, I can see where you get into a lot of trouble.
Zero.
Okay, so it's come up a couple different times, the Unity magic button that we were talking about up front, and the different engines. What are the benefits of trying to do something that is just the be-all, do-all for PC and console? What kind of problems do you run into with that?
Target specs, I think. Do you want to talk about?
Go ahead with you got.
I'm just thinking that, okay, so in my company, we work in Unity. That's what we do our VR stuff in. But our CEO decided that we wanted to target 3 platforms. We want to target VR, we want to target desktop, and we want to target WebGL. I know, right? It's crazy. So at any rate, you've got 3 very different platforms, and yeah, Unity gives you a magic button that you can use to export to all 3, but it's insane because when you've got a desktop, frame rate isn't necessarily like the hugest thing, but you need to have good graphical fidelity. When you're in VR, frame rate is king. If you don't have like a solid 60 frames, you get people who come out of that with motion sickness. And if you're trying to show that off to an investor who's trying to invest in your VR company, they're going to say, no, VR isn't advanced enough yet. We don't want to buy into this.
Barf instead of give you money.
Yeah, exactly. And they'll say, oh, we can see the technology isn't here yet. Get back to us in a few years. When with a little more optimization, like trying to target for VR instead of for desktop, you could have made something that was performant enough to make it work. And then WebGL, oh my goodness, most browsers don't even have built-in support for graphics cards, so you have to count on like the onboard chipset sometimes in order to try and make it so that,
integrated.
I know, right? Or just running it entirely on the CPU if you don't have it. So trying to
Old days. Flashbacks.
Yeah, you can press a button and it will say, okay, play this in WebGL, but you'd be lucky if you even got a slideshow instead of just crashing with some sort of memory exception. So, Unity does try to make it easy, but Unity doesn't make it easy to export everywhere at once. They make it easy to export to a target platform, assuming that you have designed with that target platform in mind.
Input devices.
Yeah, input devices. Which controllers are you supporting and how? Doing the native VR controllers is something totally different from. And if you try to treat them like game controllers, people aren't going to like it. And PC is not even going to have those most of the time, and other ones you have to do the mapping. The other thing too is Unity. There is an extra license cost for most consoles. So if you're going to target PlayStation 4, you're going to need to buy that license of Unity, which is going to cost you, I forget what, it's like another $5,000 or something. So you need to be serious. You need to have skin in the game before you just say I'm going to make games for consoles. Although Microsoft, if you use their tools and stuff, they've made it a lot easier to port games from the PC to the Xbox One. So I think you can avoid that cost. A lot of it, too, is targeting for lower-end hardware. Consoles, lower end, you can get lower end on PCs as well. But the Switch, I haven't programmed anything for the Switch, but usually for the consoles, especially small, things like the Switch, that's, your CPU is going to be less powerful. And especially, like you said, with something like Unity, you're going to run into performance issues. It's big. When you do a game, if you did a game that was using a much smaller, tighter engine, it'll fit better. Especially when you're dealing with battery power, the more code you've got running on there, it's going to suck up the battery power a lot faster. Something that I didn't even think of until I was talking to some developers who worked on those platforms. Anyway, and it is just going to be very inefficient and not work so great on these lower end platforms. The biggest advantage with consoles of all is just the hardware that you're working on, and especially if you whether you use Unity or you're custom or something with their tools, it's you write it once and it works on that console. I remember there were some issues. I don't know if this is again if the engine deals with it at all, but I remember when we had the PlayStation 2, and one of the gotchas was that the developer box that you had for the PlayStation 2 was not exactly the same as the consumer PlayStation 2. That's how they could charge you a lot more money for it. But you could also do a lot more debugging, and it had it was a lot more resources. But it had where the original had what was it, like 8 meg or something like that of running RAM or something like that, and the PlayStation developer kit had 32. Had a lot more, which meant that we didn't know that we had blown our memory budget for a long time. And we had artists who wanted to use like 1K texture maps for eyeballs, and we're like, no, these eyeballs are like 6 pixels at most that you're going to see on the screen. Why do you need this gigantic map for? And of course, if you tell them to shrink it down, the artists are all like, but it's going to look terrible if you do that. It's like, no one's going to see it. It's tiny. So the texture maps had just totally blown our budget. And, on a PlayStation, any of the PlayStations, what you've got is what you got. And so we were unaware of that. And then suddenly we're like, okay, we have to drop the budget down for all our code and everything a whole lot to get it to fit on the PlayStation. And that was a problem because we were using an engine. It was not Unity, but it was an engine that was targeting all 3 platforms, all 5. We had the Wii, the PlayStation 2, the Xbox 360, the PC. Had the ability, I think, to target PS3, but we weren't. For that, I was telling Tell of Despero stories. But anyway, you had to deal with things like, for this console over here, it has a different format that it wants to use for textures for what works efficiently on this machine versus this other one. And by using our common code and trying to target 2 consoles at the same time, it ended up being, even with homebrew code that we had control over, it was very inefficient on the Wii, and we had to do a whole bunch of special code and special tricks to get it to work well on the Wii. And that's just something you're dealing with if you're going wide on multiple platforms. You're going to run into fights like that because that's their special sauce, and that's how they're able to produce a very powerful console cheaply.
He was talking about performance issues. Just whatever engine you use, make sure to try and disable as much of it as you can, because I can guarantee you that the engine is doing stuff that you don't even know about, that you don't need it to do, that if you turn it off will make your game run faster.
Yeah, your networking layer and stuff like that. The other thing is whether it's a magic button or not. I mean, in addition to efficiency things, there's going to be some times with the consoles with developing for the multiple platforms. It's still, that was the idea of Java and a bunch of others. It's like write once, run everywhere. And the joke was, that the developers, after they got their hands on it, was write once, debug everywhere. And it's totally different bugs from platform to platform. And so it's like we have this, and it turns out that this type of code doing it on this machine totally does not work over on this one. So it's great to do that because it does save you an awful lot of work, but it's not a silver bullet. You are going to have to, it's a very good chance you're going to have to go in and do some console specific code and put in a really awful code that you hate seeing inside there saying, if this is this device, then do it this way. Otherwise, do it this way, unless it's this other console over here, in which case we don't have nearly the VRAM that we need to, so we have to grab these smaller textures over here for everything to fit. There's going to be some ugly stuff in
Our
there.
code base looks so ugly given that we're targeting VR and WebGL.
I just can't even imagine. That's like,
so bad.
VR and WebGL, I could both see you could have a more simplified visuals to try and get them to work because you want the speed in VR versus desktop. But yeah, that boy. Horror stories.
And one thing that I don't think is as much of an issue now as it used to be is the difference in quality of the development tools. Way back when Jay and I were working together originally, just comparing the Sony PlayStation development tools to the Xbox tools that I was using a year or two later, there's a huge difference in what those tools could do. What have you found that's...
Gotta ask which one was better.
PlayStation 1, probably.
Yeah, the original PlayStation development tools were like bare metal programming. The stuff for the Xbox was much more higher level library based coding. And so the tools for debugging and all of those sorts of things, attaching to a remote process, a lot of that just came along with the Microsoft tools. And so there were some huge advantages there. And you might want to tell your black triangle story.
Oh, yeah. Well,
making that first thing show up on the screen, the way you do that varies so much from one architecture to the next.
Yeah, the PlayStation 1 development environment was actually better from what I heard people than the PS2 or the PS3. I'm trying to remember which one it was. It's like they regressed over time. Here's a much more powerful machine, and here's a lot crappier tools to use to work with it. That's just something that you just need to talk to other developers and find out what they do and where they tear their hair out, because every machine's got its quirks. Yeah, the Black Triangle story, this was a funny thing, was when I first started at Single Track, and they were targeting PlayStation 1, which wasn't called PlayStation 1 at the time. It was, Sony's, so I think they called it PSX or something like that, which later became a different product. But it was all the mystery device, and people thought, oh no, it was going to fail because how could you possibly beat Sega? Sega's going to bury you. And but we were trying to get this whole pipeline in place to get stuff to run. I wrote a story about this. It was like my one and only viral post ever, and it was ancient. But I was there, after a week or so, and they were trying to get this whole thing to get it from our basic tools all the way through the tools, having the texture and everything, and to produce models and stuff inside our engine, our custom engine. And so there had to be a whole lot of engine work that was done to make this work. There had to be a whole bunch of tools pipeline as we take this raw data from these commercial off-the-shelf tools and massage it and tweak it and do everything we needed to so it could be loaded up by our stuff and finally show it a textured and lit polygon. And it was capable of doing, of course, full models, but getting that pipeline was such an ordeal. It was a lot of work from a lot of people to get it to go. And then finally one day, early on, but it was after I'd been there for like a week or two, they suddenly got a black triangle up on the screen. And it was a black triangle. And the whole thing is it was going through the entire tools chain, from all the way over here on this modeling tool, all the way through, loaded up automatically by our system. And then it was lit and textured, and all this stuff was being applied to it. Of course, we didn't have any lights, so it came out black against dark blue background because that was the default. But it still meant that at this point, the whole system was working and we were ready to get going. And everybody's cheering and we're going crazy. And our company controller, the accountant, came in to find out what all the hubbub was about. and she's taking a look and she's like, it's a black triangle. We're like, we know, look, and we were able to move the black triangle with the controllers because we could change the eye point around, which was a huge thing for us. It was like the foundation is laid. We are ready to build. Well, she's looking at this thing, and I could see the mental math she was doing. She's like, we need to produce 2 games inside of 6 months for Sony contractually, and they're going to have millions of these polygons, and it's just taken you guys 3 weeks to produce one. And she's just like, we're doomed. And she just totally didn't get it. We tried to explain to her what it meant. And that's probably going over a lot of your heads too. But at the time, anyway, that was really funny. So whenever we're talking about all the work you have to do to get the foundation laid, to get stuff going, that's a black triangle. And so there you go. It's a little term.
Yeah, one of the things about Unity is the other engines, all of those kind of bypass a bunch of that pain and anguish.
We're so entitled. All we need to do is drag a Maya file into the hierarchy and bing, it's all imported.
It's so awesome. You can make a change, move it in there, and the game will automatically update it for you.
You don't even need to drag it in there. You can have a PSD file and you save it in Photoshop and it'll detect the change and pull it in automatically.
I feel like getting out my cane, you kids get off my lawn.
We do love these higher level engines like Unity, and they've definitely made things a lot easier. There's, it's still problems, but compared to the old days, it's not nearly as bad.
So there are some huge advantages. That's why these engines exist. Somebody's done a bunch of the hard work for you. And it's nice because that goes across PCs and consoles. Especially the engines that can do across multiple platforms. So there are a bunch of really cool options there. One thing that I wanted to touch on, though, it takes us in kind of a different direction. What about the differences in distribution? We kind of mentioned that a little bit earlier.
Okay.
You're more current on those than I am.
So in terms of distribution, I've already mentioned this, but PC is getting really, well, it's easy to distribute on. It's difficult to get people to buy the stuff that you're distributing because it's called the infinite shelf space or infinite bookshelf or something like that, that just you can put everything up online. And because of that, the only way to get people to notice your stuff is through word of mouth, advertising, all of those other sort of traditional things, because you can't just have somebody wander through and look at stuff on Steam and say, oh, wow, this looks interesting, because there's so much stuff on Steam that unless you're already doing well, they aren't going to promote you because they want to promote the stuff that's going to sell. And if you aren't selling, then they don't want to promote you. But it's a lot easier. Like, I was surprised by how little stuff there was on the PlayStation 4 store that when I was looking for like a new RPG, and I'm just like, well, let's see what's there, and there are only 10 pages of options. I'm like, wow, where are all of the games? But then the stuff that's there has been pretty much curated by PlayStation, so if you can get onto the store, you've got a much better chance of being selected just by random browsing, and you have basically no chance of that on Steam. In terms of other platforms, it's even worse on like the iPhone App Store. That's another platform that we haven't even gotten into at all, is mobile distribution. That's like PC, but worse on all fronts, because like you think there's maybe there's more variance in PC than there is in mobile distribution, but they do a lot better job like covering it up. But like all of the different mobile platforms that you can be on, and screen sizes, and
I forget, my information is out of date, but I remember someone saying something to the effect of like how many games appear per hour on the App Store. And it was like, if someone was just focusing on just playing games, they could like play one game every 3 minutes, and and they'd have to do that without sleeping or eating, and just do that, and it was just like, that's insane.
So, I mean, yeah, in terms of distribution, it's very easy to get on the iPhone App Store or the Android App Store, but you will have zero free publicity, I guess you could say, zero people who just browse into your game.
Yeah, and that's generally how it ends up looking, regardless of, and again, unless you're on a very curated platform, which has its own problems. Mm-hmm. But otherwise, you just figure you've got a piece of a shelf at Walmart, Superstore, a little tiny piece of shelf. It's not a whole lot of people are going to pick it up and browse it and just I wonder what this is.
Walmart's better than that.
Yeah,
but
that's the analogy. It's like you've got a way to distribute it. You've got a way for people to use their credit card they've got a place where they feel safe doing it. Whereas if you're doing it from your own website, there might be some problems with that. With security, and they don't trust you, and how do I know I'm downloading a game that's not just a big piece of malware or something like that? So those are things, but you really have to consider it as just a storefront, like a shelf at Walmart. Mm-hmm. It is no longer marketing. Back in the early days of the App Store, guys could do a fart emulator and make, $10,000 on a, 2-hour project. That was great. If you can get in on a major platform in the first 2 or 3 months, you can make a lot of money doing that.
But then a lot of people think, apps are the future, and if you have outdated information, then you can start targeting platforms that used to be very lucrative that no longer are.
Yeah, well, 3 months, that's not a very long development cycle if you're doing anything other than a, fart generator. And so you really have to kind of think, and any platform is going to be like that after a while. You just assume that, and you have to plan a different method of marketing. Getting onto the platform is not enough. It is, if it ever is enough, it's only for a short time.
Yeah, we've kind of hit it from a few different angles peripherally, but what about the difference between the complete independent developer versus the larger company? We've kind of mentioned some things tied to that, but what are some of the differences in the worries that you face that way? PC versus console as an independent instead of the bigger company?
If I understand your question.
It kind of ties into what you were talking about, the infinite shelf space. As an indie, you just make something and bang, it's out there along with 5 billion other things.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
What are some of the things that are either easier or more difficult when you have a company backing you versus as on your own?
Oh, you've got
Onboarding fees.
Yeah, you got. If you're an employee at a company, you've got job security for 3 whole months at least. And whereas if you're an indie, you've got none. I don't know if that's a big benefit, but working for a company, they're doing. You've got a little role. Your job is. There is. I forget, someone was talking about their job was entirely doing you were doing like golf ball physics or something like that at Microsoft. That was your whole job.
Yeah.
The golf ball physics guy. Whereas with an indie, you're a much smaller team. You're working on that, and you have to wear many hats. You have to worry about stuff that you normally let your publisher or your company worry about. The marketing. How is this going to be marketed? If you're a programmer or the artist at a game company, who cares? That's their problem. But it's very much your problem, and that's going to take a lot of your time. It's going to set business deals, all of that, and the whole question of will this or won't this be able to be put on the PlayStation Store? If you're a little nobody indie, it's going to be a lot harder. And there's going to be expenses. Normally what happens is if you send it to the consoles and they have to do an approval process, usually what they do is they will recommend a company to do the testing for you in advance, which only costs, $10,000 or so. And the first time you go through their process, if they accept it the very first time, it's free. They will go through the first round free. If they reject it for whatever reason, anytime, I forget what it was. I think it was for a non-indie console game for like Xbox, I think it was for every resubmit, it was like a $40,000 fee.
Oh my goodness.
So when they recommended a company that you work with and spend thousands of dollars for them to kind of pre-screen you, it's like they would make sure that you would get through the first time, so you'd only be spending maybe $8,000, $10,000 to make sure you got it right the first time, rather than the delay that would be involved in a resubmit. Because with a resubmit, again, you're on their schedule. You get in the first time when they've got the slot for you. If they reject it and you say, oh, here, I just fixed this bug, the next day, and this should pass, and they say, well, I'm sorry, our next time we can do the next time slot is, in 3 or 4 more weeks. Well, you might have blown your Christmas, launch date if you do that. And if you're bigger, you're doing AAA games, you miss Christmas, you're screwed. You've done all your marketing in advance too, and it's like, if you're late a month, that kind of blows a lot of the hype and because they try and make sure that's all. Anyway, there's a lot of factors that get involved in there, and there can be some frustrations as well, which is why a lot of places have kind of an indie route for the less curated stuff. So you've got the more mainstream games, and then you have, okay, here's for the poor paupers like us, to go through, and it's not as heavily curated, and they let us in through a back door, and we try and make money at it. So
one thing I was curious about, how many of you have been either taking classes or developing games on your own, either for fun or for selling? How many of you have got some involvement in game development now?
About half.
Okay, so how disillusioned are you after hearing some of the war stories? Or is this something that you still think, that sounds like a lot of fun?
I want to cry.
Okay.
Brennan, can we talk about some of their development experiences?
I don't feel a need to. I mean,
Going to make more people cry.
so yeah, I mean, these are two people that worked on we were working on a month-long game jam in order to try and get a publisher interested in us, and we got in third place, and we were super proud of ourselves, and we worked with that publisher for about 6 months, sort of like getting them sort of on the line, and then finally they said, we're sorry, we kept you on the line for as long as we did because we were hoping that we would find funding for you, but we don't have it, so we're going to have to let you guys go. And so we lost what we thought was a contract that we had won through being the third best person in this design competition, and it was a real blow, but we're still working on it. We're going to at least put it up on Steam, see if we can get like our $500 medium payout for it, because that's what you get for self-publishing on Steam these days, is unless you've got like a whole bunch of marketing or something behind you. The median game on Steam makes $500 through sales. So
Yeah, but when you ask how much does an indie game make, it's kind of like how long is a piece of string?
yeah,
You know, it's like somewhere between 0 and Minecraft. With a much bigger trend towards the 0.
but the median game on Steam that has a publisher is $50,000. So, and the previous year's winner in that competition that we entered, the first place winner, they got a total of 200,000 units sold. So I mean, like we were like, yeah, we got into this contest. We're gonna and then it just everything fell apart. Yeah. So that's our sad sob story, but.
As you know, I've been a big proponent of indie since before it was a thing, because if you talk to many game developers who are in the field professionally full time with big companies, you'll hear the same thing. I love making games. I hate the video games industry, and that's almost universal. It really is. It's like the video game industry sucks, but making games is cool. And I'll tell you, it's like writing. It's like books and everything else. You know, the first time when you create an indie game, and it's yours. There's much more investment than when you're working with a big company and you're just a cog working on, golf ball physics, or the AI Spearman physics, or the AI, something like that. When you're working on it, you're on a small team. You got a huge amount of ownership. It is your game, your design, your stuff, and you put it out there. And even if it's not a big seller the first time, someone pays you real money, their hard-earned money for your game. And you're like, holy cow, they like it. They think it's okay. It is a huge feeling. And, and you can fall all under this. I hate doing the median thing because the median thing kind of lies. But,
Yeah.
it really is. It's a huge spectrum. Some games fail terribly. Some games are a surprise hit out of nowhere, and you never know. It's rough. You have to work and plan your business, plan it like a business. But it is a great experience. I love indie gaming. I love the freedom that it gives, and I love the experimentation that happens there. Experimentation means there's no guarantees, and 90% of experiments fail. But you get some really cool stuff out of it too that you're just never going to see out of a big AAA studio, and that includes again consoles, PC, handheld devices. Mobile devices, etc.
Thank you so much for coming and listening to us.